Yes, with the name. Yeah, yesterday I was going to announce them. He's here. All right, so we'll say, so our learning today is dedicated, first of all, by Anne Berman in memory of, Anne Berman and Lydia Berman, Mrs. Berman in memory of his son and husband Sheldon Berman, Shmuel Yoel ben Shalom Tuvia, as well as by Hal and Vicky Kane in memory of Hal's father Moshe ben Yosef HaKohen. And Mr. and Mrs. Martyr sponsored yesterday's shir, and we're going to dedicate our learning again today. Mr. Martyr, the name? Mr. Martyr, the name? Rebbetzin Shoshana Rezel Bas Menachem Mendel, and we hope in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of these neshamas have an aliyah. All right, so we'll say, so we have a lot to do today. So we left off, really a lot to do today. We left off, today's daf is Chavav, but we left off, today's daf is Chavav, we left off Chav Hey Amud Beis, only 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines down from the top. So remember again, the Mishnah said, Haraktiv, Hargnu Tinase. So remember again, we'll say the Mishnah had a case where the aide shows up and says, I killed your husband, says to the woman, I killed your husband in Beis Din, or says that we killed your husband in Beis Din. So remember again, we had Machlokes Tanakam and Rabbi Huda. But everybody agrees that in the case of Harganuhu, that ultimately, again, the testimony is believed, but the aide is not permitted to marry the woman. So the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, Umayshna haraktiv, umayshna harganuhu. Why is it that if the witness says, I killed your husband, then what? Then at least according to Rabbi Huda, he's not believed at all. Right? According to the Rabbanon, he's believed, but Lamaise can't marry them. According to Rabbi Huda, he's not believed at all. But yet, again, in the case of harganuhu, we killed your husband, that, again, the husband is believed, according to everyone, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, what's the case? Ba'omer ani hayisi im hargav. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, the case is not where he says, we killed him. The case is where what? Where the man, the aide says, I was with the group that killed your husband. I was there, but I did not participate. I v'hatanya. Amulol Rabbi Yehuda, they said to Rabbi Yehuda, Maisa belistim echad shiatzele harik b'mezigas kaputkia, that they said there was an episode of a listim, a robber who was going to be executed by Gentile authorities. Megizas kaputkia, which are literally the crossroads of kaputkia. For Amrulahem, listen to this. So as the robber is being led out to be executed, he cries out, L'chu amrulei le'ish Shimon ben Cohen, go and tell the wife of Shimon ben Cohen, Ani harakti es baila. Go and tell her I killed her husband. In other words, no, why would you say such a thing like that? Because obviously, again, they were wondering about the whereabouts of her husband. She was effectively in aguna. So as he's about to be executed, he says, just tell her I killed her husband. And what happened? As I was walking into the city of Lud, or others say it was when the husband was walking into Lud. And what happened? The Esiu es ishto, and they married off. They allowed the wife of Shimon ben Cohen to go ahead and marry based on the testimony of this individual being led out to be executed. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that Lamaisa, again, now this is a case of haraktiv. This is a case of literally where the aide is saying, I killed the guy. And yet what? And yet we see that Lamaisa, he is believed. To which the Gemara said, he said to them, is that a raya? But Omer ani hayisim hargav. No. The case over there is not where the guy who was being executed said, I killed Shimon ben Cohen's husband, but rather, again, not where he said, I killed Shimon ben Cohen, but rather where he says, I was with the group who killed Shimon ben Cohen. I vaha listim katani. But one second, if that's the case, then why does it call him a listim? Shenitbas al yedei listios. Because ultimately, again, he was captured by the Gentile authorities because of robbery. He was guilty of the crime of robbery. I v'hayat the hari katani. So I'll say, but one second. But why are they executing him for robbery? Meaning that sounds a little bit harsh for robbery. To which the Gemara says, Beidina de ovdei kochavim the lo daiki v'katli, because again this was a Gentile court, and in Gentile courts often they executed people even for relatively minor infractions. So we'll say what comes out over here. Therefore, the Gemara qualifies the statement of the Mishnah. Then the Mishnah's model, it's not where he's saying we killed the husband where he's believed. It's where the aide says I was with the group who killed your husband. Ultimately, again, I did not participate in that, but I was with the group, and therefore, again, I saw what happened. So according to both Tanna Kama and Rabbi Huda, his testimony is believed, but of course, he is not permitted to marry the woman herself. Says the Mishnah, Hachacham she'aser es ha'isha b'neder al baila. Hari Zulu Yasenabos is another very interesting case. So what happens? So let's say a woman goes ahead and makes a neder. So according to Rashi, the neder is she takes a neder not to get any benefit from her husband. So obviously, if a woman makes a neder like that, it makes marriage a little bit complicated. So what happens? So she goes to the Chacham, she goes to the Rav, and he is unable to annul that vow for her. Now we'll discuss this. He's unable to go ahead and now remember again. We'll say annulment of vows. It's not like what we do at Taras Nadarim on Erev Rosh Hashanah, right? Hakal mutter lach, hakal sharoi lach, and kan lo neder lo. All right, so that's a much more symbolic revocation of vows. Real revocation of vows requires what we call charata or a pesach, right? You have to find an obi, meaning it's a technical. So let's say she goes to the chacham. The chacham says, "Listen, I can't help you. You're stuck with this neder." So we'll say, so what happens as a result? Husband divorces the wife. So, because again, you can't have a marriage under those kind of circumstances. So the Mishnah says that the Talmid Chacham, right, the Rav, who paskin that he cannot annul the vow, can't what? Can't marry her after her husband divorces her, because it looks a little bit fishy if suddenly again he can't find the Pesach, and right after they divorce, the Talmid Chacham goes in and marries her. Miyana. However, if a woman does miyun, remember I'll say miyun is the process, again, remember if a woman was married off, girl was married off as a ketana by her mother or her brother, she has the ability simply to refuse her husband. And again, that retroactively dissolves the marriage. Or a woman does chalitza b'fanav, in front of the Talmid Chacham, he is permitted to marry her. Why? The Gemara says, mipnei shu beizin, because you'll both say, remember, in both of those cases of miyun as well as chalitza, you require a bezdin. Therefore, again, even though the Chacham is part of the Beis Din, we don't view it as if he didn't do it of his own volition on his own. Therefore, because he's part of the collective, therefore, L'maisa, again, he would be permitted to go ahead and marry a woman who did miyun or chalitza as part of his Beis Din. Says the Gemara, ha-hetira, yisa'ena. And interestingly enough, what's the case here? From the Mishnah, what it sounds like is like this. Now, the Mishnah's case is, a woman comes before the Chacham, says, I made an neder not to get benefit from my husband. So if the Chacham says, I'm sorry, I can't help you, and then the husband divorces her, so the Talmid Chacham may not marry the woman. But it sounds like, let's say the Talmid Chacham did release her from the neder. Did release her, and then let's say for some reason later on the couple gets divorced, then what? The Chacham would be permitted to go ahead and marry this woman. So the Gemara says, 1 second. So, b'maya askinan. I will say now, how exactly is this Chacham going ahead and releasing her from this vow? Ilema b'chad, if we're talking about a singular Talmid Chacham, chad mimatzi matir, is a Talmid Chacham, an individual able to go ahead and be matir neder. V'ha'amar Rabbi Ami, v'ha'amar Reb Chia bar Abin Amrav Amram, Tana hataras nedarim b'shlosha. In order to go ahead and do revocation of vows, you require 3 people. Ve'ela betlasa. So maybe you're going to say the Mishnah's case is with 3. Michashidi. So we'll say whenever you have something done by a group of 3, the individual is not suspect of working for personal motivations. Because after all, we learned v'hatnan miyana oshe chaltza b'fanav yisa'ena mipnei shu beizin. We learned in the Mishnah that if a woman does miyun or chalitza in a beizin, one of the dayanim is permitted to marry that woman after the fact. So the Gemara says the olam bechad. In reality, the case of the neder is where there's one Talmid Chacham. Ukida Amar Rav Chisda Amar Rav Yochanan biyachid mumche. Hachanai biyachid mumche. We'll say, and remember again, as much as normally hataras nedarim revocation of vows requires a beis din of 3, there's one exception, which is if you have yachid mumche. Yachid mumche means an individual who is a recognized expert. So an individual who is a recognized expert in the realm of nedarim has the ability to do revocation of vows, even as an individual. That must be the case that the Mishnah is referring to. Miyana oshe chaltza, if she did miyun or chalitza in front of the Beis Din. ultimately, one of the Dayanim was able to marry this woman after the fact, since he did not release her on his own. So the Gemara says, "Time of the Beis Din." The reason why the Mishnah allows for one of the Rabbanim to marry the woman is because it's a Beis Din. Habitre lo. But it sounds like what? It sounds like if it was just a group of two Rabbanim who were doing this, that one of them would not be permitted to go ahead and marry the woman after the fact. What is different than that which we learned before? The I'll get Isha lo chashu chachamim ledavar. So we'll say, we learned, it's interesting, that if you have witnesses who signed on, let's say, the sale of a field, or witnesses that sign on the get of a woman, lo chashu dvarim ledavar zeh. Right? The rabbis were not concerned for this. So we'll say, now what does that mean? If you look at Rashi is lo chashu chachamim ledavar zeh, lo mar lo yikchu shuv sadezu min alokeach, v'china eid shall get lo yisez ish. I will say, if Edom sign on a document of sale of a field, and one of those Edom later on wants to buy that field, no problem. Or if witnesses sign on a get, and afterwards again one of the witnesses wants to marry the divorcee, there's no problem. There's no problem. So the Gemara says, therefore, the Maisa, again, it sounds like the only time there's a problem is when you are the one individual who is affecting the change in status of the woman. But if you're not a one individually working with another person, then the Maisa, it sounds like you don't need a Beis Din, but any group of two or more, one of those individuals would be able to marry the woman. So the which the Gemara says, I'll tell you, Zoe Gufa Kamashlan, this is teaching us an important idea. La Fuki Man Damar Miyun Bifnei Shnai Kamashlan Miyun Gimel. Well, say because the Mishnah is teaching us another halacha, which is that there's a fundamental machlokes as to the context in which miyun must occur. So there is an opinion that holds that miyun could occur in front of two witnesses, or in front of two. But the Mishnah is going to teach us that we paskin that miyun must occur in front of a Beis Din, a minimum of 3 rabbanim. Okay, Ibaylehu. Kanas Maushi Yotzi. Well, it's not the Gemara Kasha. What happens if the man we just said was not permitted to go ahead and marry this woman, went ahead and married the woman? Well, so let's play this out. Woman comes to the Chacham to go ahead and annul her vow that she can't get hana from her husband. Chacham says, I can't help you. Husband divorces his wife. The Mishnah says, Tam Chacham, you may not marry that woman. It doesn't look right. Let's say he married her. Right? Or for that matter, again, from last Mishnah. So the aide shows up and says, Fa'inechtam, the get was written in front of me, was sealed in front of me. Testimony is affected on his behalf. We said, shouldn't marry him, shouldn't marry the woman. But let's say he did. So let's say you have cases over here where there are men who should not be marrying these women, but they did so anyway. What is the status of the marriage? So the Gemara says, Rav Kana Amar Kanas Motzi. Rav Kana says, listen, if you marry her, you have to divorce her, because the Mishnah said you shouldn't marry her. Rav Ashi Amar Kanas Ena Motzi. And Rav Ashi said, no, even if you married her, you shouldn't have married her, but if you did so, you don't have to divorce her. Tani Lahu Rav Zuti Debei Rav Papa. Kedivre Omar Kanas Ena Motzi. So Rav Zuti Debei Rav Papa said that it seems to be the halacha follows the one who says that if he married her, he need not divorce her. Amrli Rav another Rav Ashi Gemara Osvara. So the rabbis asked Rav Ashi, you who said that if you marry the woman, you don't have to divorce her, is that a Gemara? Meaning, Rabbi say Gemara means, is that a tradition that you receive? Is that a Masorah? You receive this from your Rebbeim? Or Svara? Or is this your own logic? Amar lahu masnisinhi. It's a Mishnah. Hanitan mishivcha v'nishtachera. Excuse me. Hanitan mishivcha v'nishtachera. If there's a previous Mishnah, if a man, where there are rumors about a man having an intimate relationship with a shivcha, and then she was emancipated, or there are rumors that he's had a relationship with a Gentile woman, v'niskaira, and she converted. Hareza lo yichnos. He should not marry these women. V'im kanas, and if he did, ein motzi. We don't make him divorce. Alma, therefore, what do you see? Top of the Chavav. Birinana lamafkinon. Rabbi say, what do we see? We see that we don't make people divorce because of rumors. Hachanai birinana lamafkinon. Therefore, Allah Chamaisa over here, so too also we will say that we do not go ahead and make people divorce because of rumors. So Rabbi say again, when the rumor mill is at work, or when the rumor mill could be at work, we say better to stay away from such a marriage. But lamaisa, if you married the woman, if the only thing that's working against you now, if there's a rumor circulating, then lamaisa, again, we're not going to make you divorce because of rumor. Of course, I will say, remember, this goes in line with what we learned yesterday. Obviously, if a rumor satisfies certain halachic criteria, as you saw in yesterday's daf, that could force the dissolution of a marriage. But assuming that the rumor does not conform to this criteria, even though that rumor was enough for the rabbis to say, please don't marry this woman. If they married, we would not make them divorce. Says the Mishnah. This is another interesting case. All of these cases before, where we said that the man should not marry the woman. For example, again, he shows up in Beis Din and he is the one who says, I know that your husband died. Or or he is the chacham who cannot go ahead and annul or revoke her vow. In all of these cases, let's say Rabbosai, these men were married at the time of these events, and then what happens? Afterwards, their wife died. Right, so a simple case. So Talmid Chacham's wife died. He couldn't revoke the vow. Husband divorces his wife. Then the Talmid Chacham's wife dies at a later time. At that point in time, mutaros li nasi lahem. The men listed in the Mishnah could go back and marry these women. They can go back and marry these women afterwards. Why? So again, the logic over there is more obvious. Why? Because Lamaisa, since they were married at the time that these events occurred, and their wives died subsequently, if they go and they marry these women who they permitted, or in the case of Chacham did not permit, it doesn't look like there's any kind of marital collusion going on over here. Similarly, if let's say any of these women mentioned went ahead and married someone else, they married another man. So, for example, let's just stick with the b'fanei nechtam case. So what happens? So Reuven shows up in Beis Din and says b'fanei nechtam. Therefore assures the validity, we'll call her, of Leah's get. Leah goes and marries another guy. So the halach is Leah can't marry Reuven. So what happens? But Leah marries someone else, and then this is now her second husband, dies or divorces her. Leah would then be permitted to marry who? Would then be permitted to marry Reuven, the guy who essentially established the validity of her divorce. Because why, since she's already been married to another man, it doesn't look like what Reuven said or did, what Reuven said was in order to allow him to marry the woman of Haraya, she married someone else. As soon as in all of these cases where we say that the woman may not marry the man who essentially is responsible for changing her status, she would be permitted to marry the son of this man or the brother of this man, just not the man himself. So the Gemara says, Mesu in Niskar Shulo. And also what's interesting is the Mishnah said that if, let's say again, the man who was responsible for changing her status was married at the time when this happened, and his wife subsequently died, he'd be permitted to go ahead and marry this woman. But it sounds like what? Only if his wife died. If he divorced his wife, he would not be permitted to marry this woman. Now, both say that makes sense to us. Why? Because Lamaisa, again, divorce, remember, is a process that's initiated. It could very well be that what happens, he now met this woman in Beis Din, says, wow, okay, so maybe he's going to divorce his wife, ultimately again, in order to marry her. Therefore, it sounds like what the Gemara's dafka saying is, it's only if his wife dies, does he have the license then afterwards to marry her, to which the Gemara says, Amrli Rav Ravashi. Rav Hillel said to Ravashi, Vatanya, but we learn, Afilu Niskarsha. But yet there's a brisa that says, no, even if the men who were responsible for the change in status of this woman, if their wife died, if they divorced, they also would be permitted to marry this woman afterwards. Lo kasha, the Gemara says not a kasha, hada havai katata, hada lo havai katata. It's actually very interesting. The Gemara says it depends on the nature of their marriage. If they had a contentious marriage, even before he ever testified in Beis Din, meaning let's say they had a contentious marriage before he said b'far nechtam, or the chacham has a contentious marriage before he's unable to permit her vow, or any of the other cases, so therefore the marriage was already rocky from the beginning. I'm sorry? It has to have a kol that it's rocky, right? So again, if well, it must obviously. Otherwise, how do you establish it? Otherwise, it's got to be known in some way. It's got to be known. So if there was difficulty in the marriage prior to his testimony in Beis Din, so then Lamaisa again the fact when the marriage dissolves, he's permitted to marry this woman, because we don't assume that he divorced his wife to marry this woman, because Lamaisa again the marriage was rocky from the beginning. However, again, if suddenly the marriage was fine, but then after he comes home from Beis Din and he says b'far nechtam, suddenly again from that point forward the marriage becomes a little bit contentious and rocky. Says the Gemara, that looks a little bit fishy, and therefore we will still tell him not to go ahead and marry this woman. The other possibility is pshata. The truth is, both cases, you could still look at both situations as where there was no pre-existing contention. V'lo kasha, ha da argilhu, ha da argilehi. Rabbi say, even if there was no pre-existing tension, and the tension only began after this whole thing in Beis Din, so what does it depend on? It depends, but now tension starts. Who's starting? Who is the one who is picking the fights? So if he's the one who's picking the fights, then the Maisa would say, okay, come on, everything was fine until now. Now suddenly you met this woman in Beis Din, and now suddenly you're picking fights every single day with your wife. So then again, it seems to be you're looking to get out of this marriage, and therefore we would still stick to our halachic guns and say, you should not marry her. But if she's starting up with him, which of course never happens, right? If she's starting up with him, then Lemaisa, again, that's not his fault. If it ends up in divorce, then Lemaisa, we would permit him to go ahead and marry the other woman. V'chulon shinisu. And I will say, remember again, then the next case of the Mishnah was, so let's just simply play this out. So man comes to Beis Din, says b'far nechtav, therefore establishes the validity of her divorce. So the halach is he can't marry her. But now Lemaisa, what happened? She went and married someone else. She went and married someone else, and then she got divorced from husband number 2. Then she's permitted to marry the aid. So the Gemara says, "Chasaka daitcha misa amisa v'gerushin agerushin." Now listen to this. Remember, there are 2 cases over here. Case number 1 is the Gittin case that I just told you. Case number 2 is what? Where Reuven shows up in Beis Din and says, "I know that your husband died." He says to Leah, "I know that your husband died." What happens? Leah goes ahead and gets remarried, and her second husband dies. So we're assuming now that the cases of a divorce line up with divorce and death with death. So in a case where the guy is Reuven showing up in Beis Din and says v'fay, which means Leah, you're divorced. Leah marries husband number 2, gets divorced from him. Mishnah says now Reuven, you're permitted to marry Leah. Case number 2, Reuven shows up in Beis Din. Leah, your husband's dead. Leah remarries. Second husband dies. Now Leah is permitted to marry Reuven. So again, we're assuming that cases of divorce line up with divorce, death line up with death. So the Gemara says if that's the case, our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rebbe. Why? Di'i Rebbe ha'amar betray zimni havya chazaka. Both said it's actually very interesting. We'll get into this sugya later on. There's a concept called a katlanis. A katlanis, essentially, for lack of a better term, is like a black widow, right? The idea over here is that if a woman is married to multiple men, not at the same time, obviously, successive marriages, and they're dying, the halacha says something is going on. Something's going on. So we're actually going to do this sugya. There's a machlokes as to how many husbands you have to knock off in order to go ahead and be called a katlanis, right? Is it 2 or is it 3? Now, both say if you line up the case of death and death, what that means is Leah, what happens? Reuven shows up in Beis Din and says, "Leah, your husband's dead." Now, I will say, interesting. We'll have to discuss the parameters of this halacha because that sounds like a case of where maybe Leah wasn't even with her husband at all. So we're not going to get too into this sugya now. That's a sugya later on. But let's say that's husband number 1 is dead. Then Leah remarries. Husband number 2 is dead. So the Gemara is just saying this Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Zera. Like Rebbe, because Rebbe holds that whereas normally chazaka is established with 3, with matters of sakanas nefashos, so chazaka is often established with 2. So according to Rebbe, she would not be permitted to marry Reuven, because she would not be permitted to marry any man, because she would have the status of a katlonis, to which the Gemara answers, it's not a problem, the Gemara says. Lo misa gerushin v'gerushin amisa. To which the Gemara ultimately answers that l'maisa, no, you don't have to line up the case of divorce with divorce and death with death. It really, the Mishnah is not being medayik in that. That it could be that again in the case of where he testifies that her husband died, she then gets remarried, husband number 2, she gets divorced from husband number 2. Or again in the case where ultimately the aid says she's divorced, she gets married to husband number 2, and husband number 2 dies. So you don't automatically have to line up death with death and divorce with divorce. Therefore, the Mishnah could even be in accordance with Rebbe. What's an interesting halacha? So remember, in all of these cases that we've established, these women may not marry these men who essentially are responsible for changing their status. But, so as much, remember, Reuven is our guy. Reuven is the guy, he's the status changer. So as much as Leah can't marry Reuven, but the Mishnah said she can marry Reuven's son, or she can marry Reuven's brother. Now, why is this different from that which we learned? Hanitan mina isha Asr bi'ima ubebito ba'chosa. So we'll say, why is it if we learned before? Actually, we're going to see this later on. We saw the case of Nita Mina Isha, but we'll see this halacha later on. If there are rumors that a man is engaged in an illicit relationship with a woman, not only is he not permitted to marry her, but he's also not permitted to marry her mother, or her daughter, or her sister. So we see over here that in the case of where a man is suspected of an illicit union with a woman, that he can't marry her relatives. Yet in this case over here, the woman is permitted to marry the relatives of this man who changed her status. She can't marry him himself, but she can marry his siblings or whatever, his brother or his son. To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Nashi legabi nashi shchichin da azlan. Gavri legabe gavri lo shchichan. We'll say, because the Gemara says answer number one is that, remember, women often visit one another. So therefore, if a man is suspected about an illicit relationship with Leah, so what happens? If he marries Leah's sister Rachel, so Leah often comes over, and what could easily occur? If it's true that there was an illicit relationship, that relationship could continue. However, men don't really visit each other. Right, men don't really visit each other. Therefore, lemaisa again. Therefore, according at least in Talmudic times. Therefore, again, lemaisa. If Leah can't marry Reuven, who changed her status, but she marries Reuven's brother, chances are, it's interesting. It just reflects a societal norm. Chances are she's not going to see Reuven all that much. So, because she's not going to see Reuven all that much, therefore, there's no chashash that a relationship may develop. Inami, second possibility, and this is actually very interesting. Nashi de lo asran shchivasan ahadadi lo kapti. Gavri de asran shchivasan ahadadi kapti ahadadi. But I'm saying this is also fascinating, and again, it just seems to reflect certain realities. Literally, a woman knows that if her husband sleeps with another woman, it does not undermine her marriage. Now, you'll see yourself, what does that mean? It certainly meaning it undermines the fabric of the marriage. It doesn't undermine the halachic fabric of the marriage. Meaning, if a man has relations with another woman who is not his wife, it undermines the connection. But halachically, he does not become prohibited to his wife because he had an affair with someone else, even if it's an ervatim. It doesn't preclude his current marriage from going on. Therefore, the Gemara says that lemaisa. So therefore, because of that, it's almost as if the halacha is not as worried if the man goes ahead and, he's not as worried, right? Because. Well, one more time. That since lemaisa, let's read it inside. Inami nashid lo asrun shchivasan ahadadi lo kapti. So because, again, if the man has a relationship with another woman, ultimately it won't undermine his other marriage, meaning his marriage. Therefore, again, there's not a hakpada. Gavri da asrun shchivasan ahadadi. But if a woman sleeps with another man, ultimately, again, that does undermine the marriage. Therefore, kapti ahadadi. Therefore, again, they are makbid. So look at Rashi for just a moment over here. So Rashi says over here, no Rashi yet, I'm sorry. Ihachi, aviv nami aviv nami. So I'll say, if that's the case, so based on this, so why do you limit the woman's ability to go ahead and marry the brother or the son of the man who changed her status? Why can't she marry his father as well? To which the Gemara answers, Lomi Bai Kamar. You're right. I will say Lomi Bai is a stylistic statement where the Mishnah says you don't even have to, if you say this, it's understood this as well. Lomi Bai Aviv de Baziz Bane Mine. So we'll say, of course, she can marry her father. Why? Because remember, not her father, the father of Reuven. Remember, the Reuven is the status changer, so she can't marry Reuven, but she can marry Reuven's father. And there's no chashash that something may happen between her and Reuven. Why? Because the son is in general awe of his father. So because the son is in awe of his father, meaning he reveres him, he respects him. Therefore, the Maisa, again, he would never do anything with his wife. However, aval beno delo bazis mine. But I might have thought that perhaps again we should not let her marry Reuven's son. Why? Because the Maisa, again, a father is not in awe of his son. I might have thought that there might be a chashash that something may happen. Therefore, kamash malon, no. Therefore, kamash malon, that we're not worried about that. So, say halacha lemaisa. What comes out over here from this sugya is number one. As much as we've established that all of these men, meaning any time that a man is responsible for a marital status change in another woman, he is not permitted to marry her. He's not permitted to marry her. That's halacha number one. However, halacha number two, what if he did marry her? If he did marry her, l'maisa, again, the marriage works. We do not force them to divorce, even though it looks strange. Even in a case where they say they can't marry, if she married someone in the interim, or he has some dramatic marital change that doesn't seem to be that he was looking for a way out of his marriage, then in those situations, what? Halacha l'maisa, he is permitted to marry her. But however, again, as much as she is not permitted to marry him, she is permitted to marry his relatives, as opposed to the situation where l'maisa, a man is suspected of an illicit union. Not only is he not permitted to marry the woman, but what? He's also not permitted to marry the relatives of that particular woman as well. All right, the both say Hajjun Allah Keitzad Eishes Achiv. Mishnah Arba Achin. So we actually had this case. We saw this case already. Arba Achin. There are 4 brothers. Shnayim mehen nisun shtei achayos umesu. So what happens? You have 4 brothers. 2 of them are married to two sisters, and they died. The brothers who are married to the sisters die. So again, Ruvain, Shimon. This is good. This one. Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. 4 brothers. Ruvain and Shimon are married to 2 sisters. Ruvain and Shimon die. We already know this case. You guys know this one, right? Right. I'm sorry. What? No. Well, that was the more convoluted case. This is not even such a convoluted case, actually. So what happens? So 4 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. Reuven and Shimon married to 2 sisters. Reuven and Shimon die. So what happens? So we'll say now, obviously, Levi and Yehuda have 2 different sisters-in-law in front of them for Yibum. Right? There's Reuven's wife and there's Shimon's wife. So what's the halacha? Hare'elu cholzos v'lo misyavmos. The halacha is that Reuven and Shimon both do chalitza, and neither does yibum. We will see why that is. But if you take a quick look at Rashi is befarish time begimara mishum zeka dechevon detarvayhu zikikan lahai ulahai kama debiyame paga ba'achas zikuka. So the Havikishabos is very interesting. Remember we said the machlokes of yesh zeka or ein zeka. We paskin yesh zeka. There is almost actually it shouldn't be paskin. The Mishnah here is saying that there is zeka, there is already a marital bond, a type of marital bond that exists between the surviving brother and his sister-in-law. And here's the problem. The problem is, let's play this out. If Reuven and Shimon are dead, so now if Levi does yibum with, let's say, Reuven's widow, the problem is what? The problem is that he is then having relations with the sister of his zekuka. Right? Remember again, because Shimon's wife, because remember there's a zeka, there's a connection between both women and both brothers. As such, if you go ahead and do yibum, you are essentially, again, you are violating the zeka that you have towards the other woman. So it's a yibum catch 22. Essentially what the Mishnah is saying is, there is no way to deal with this situation except to do chalitza with both of the women. Vim kadmu. I'm sorry. Otherwise I'm going to be 3 days behind. Vim kadmu vikinsu. However, again, if they married them, yotziu. Then Rabbi say, listen to this. However, let's say they did yibum. So the halacha is yotziu. We force them to divorce in those circumstances. Again, we'll discuss why that is. Rabbi Eliezer Omer says Beis Shammai Omer Mikayim. So Rabbi Eliezer says, first of all, it's machlokes. Beis Shammai says that if they married them in this context, then l'maisa again you could keep them; they could remain married. Beis Hillel says no yotziu. Ha'isa achas mehen asura ala echad iser erva. Both say, listen to this. Aser ba'u mutar ba'chos. Both say, listen to this. Sheni aser b'shteyan. Both say, listen to this case. So let's say same thing. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. Reuven and Shimon are married to sisters, but it happens to be that what? It happens to be that who did Reuven marry? Reuven married his niece. He married Levi's daughter. All right, he married Levi's daughter. So Reuven is married to his niece, Levi's daughter. So what happens? Reuven and Shimon die. Now 2 women fall before Levi and Yehuda for Yibum. But one of those women happens to be who? Happens to be Levi's daughter. Now both say, remember again, we're already experts in this area of Yibum, that what happens when a woman who is in Ereva falls to you in Yibum? What happens? Nothing happens, right? Lemaisa, there's no yibum. And remember again, this is not the case of a co-wife, so she does not disqualify the other woman. So essentially, we'll say this is a case where Levi would be permitted to go ahead and do yibum with the other woman. Why? Because remember the whole reason in the first case of the Mishnah, why you couldn't do yibum with either one, because it's achos zikukaso. There is no zeka to a woman who's in erva. Therefore, effectively for Levi, there's only one yevama. So Levi has the ability to go ahead and do yibum with the other wife, meaning the one who's not his daughter. However, v'hasheni, but the other surviving brother, namely Yehuda, is still aser b'shtein, because for Yehuda's perspective, l'mais again, he still has he has a zeka to both women, and therefore again to do yibum would be a violation of achos zikukas, so he would be stuck. So essentially, in that case, the only one who could really do yibum would be Levi with the one who's not his daughter. Isser mitzvah ve'isser kiddush. Choletzes, we'll say similarly again. If you have two wives, one of them is same case, is all the same four-brother case. One of the wives is an Isser mitzvah. Rashi says Isser mitzvah ram yakamei midarais he'll asr ba'achosa the achos zikukasi. So we'll say again, this would be we're going to see this is actually a different case in the Mishnah. This is a situation. Did I skip? Okay, fine. Vashini asr b'shtein, fine. Isser mitzvah, isser kiddusha. I will say if one of the women is asr to one of the men because she's an isser mitzvah or an isser kiddusha, we saw this already. Either it means is asr midirabanan, or it means asr from an asay or a regular daraisa that doesn't carry with it a penalty of death. What's the halacha? Choletzes v'lo Yevamos. The second woman is referring to the second. And again, we're going to qualify this case in the Gemara. The second woman does chalitza, or we do chalitza with the second woman and not yibum. Haisa achas mehen asura al isser asura al ze isser erva, v'hashnia asura al ze isser erva. So we'll say, watch this. So again, it's going to be another simple case where what? Well, none of it's simple, but again, Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. So what happened over here? Ruvain married Levi's daughter. Shimon married Yehuda's daughter. Two brothers married to their nieces. What happens? Both brothers die. So essentially now two wives. One of those wives Levi can't marry because it's his daughter. One of the wives Yehuda can't marry because it's his daughter. So meaning one woman is an Isser Erva to each of them. So no problem. So the halacha is ha'asur lezem mutaris lezem. Va'asur lezem mutaris lezem. Not a problem. The one who is asr to Levi is mutter to Yehuda. The one who is mutter to Yehuda is asr, or the one who is asr to Yehuda is mutter to Levi. This is the case that we said achosa kishehi yevimta o choletzes o Yevamos. And this is the case that Chazal referred to as the sister who is the Yevimta. She could either do chalitza or she could do yibum. I will say that again. This is the case. The lav achos zikukasa he the ervel raimel. Because I will say this is not a case of achos zikukasa. Why? Because there's no zeka between the yavam and the woman who is an erva to him. Therefore, he is absolutely permitted to go ahead and do yibum with the woman who is permitted to him. Says the Gemara Shlamina. I will say what's one thing we see from this Mishnah that we can agree on? Yesh zeka. What's clear from the Mishnah, I will say, is that we accept the fact that there's zeka, meaning that when halacha l'maisa a man dies without children, that there is already a quasi-marital bond between the surviving brother and the widow. But I will say, look at Rashi for just a moment, because Rashi takes this a step further. Rashi says, Kilomar, chamura zeka l'shavuye, achos zikukaso ke'achos ishtar. And I will say, what the Gemara really means to say is like this, that this zeka is not just a connection, but what is this zeka effectively? This zeka is like a marital bond, which means, I will say, that's why in the case of Lamaisa, where the two brothers who are married to two sisters die, neither brother, surviving brother, could do yibum. Why? Because it's as if, so to speak, he has a marital bond with each of these women, and if he does yibum with either of them, it would be like what? It would be like doing yibum with his wife's sister. That's how strong the zeka is, that it creates almost a marital bond. So if you would try to do yibum with either one of these women, it'd be like doing yibum with one's wife's sister, which of course is aser. Says the Gemara, "Di'e in zeka," because if you don't accept the concept of zeka, michti hani mitrei basi ka'asyon. Because remember, I'll say these two women, right, the widows of the two deceased brothers, are coming from two different marriages. So if there's no zeka, let one surviving brother do yibum with one of the women, another surviving brother could do yibum with the other woman, and there's no problem. To which the Gemara says, the olam im lecha in zeka. The truth is, I would tell you, there's still no zeka. So what's the problem over here? Mishum dekasavar asr levatal mitzas yavmim. Because we'll say, what are we concerned about? It's asr to negate the performance of yibum in some way, shape, or form. What does that mean? Dilma, because what are we concerned about? I'll say, remember, case number one in the Mishnah. Four brothers, Reuven and Shimon married to two sisters. Reuven and Shimon die. So the Mishnah said they have to be chotz, they have to chalisa. So we assume the reason for that is because yesh zeka. The Gemara says, no, that's true even if ain't zeka. Why? Because what are we concerned about? Because let's play this out. Let's say we let them do yibum. Dilma adam yabim chad mayis idach v'kamavatel mitzas yavmin. Because we'll say what happens. Let's say we allow surviving brothers to do yibum. So now we're going to have Levi do yibum. So Levi does yibum with Ruvain's widow, and what happens? Right after Levi does yibum, before Yehuda is able to do anything, what happens? Shimon dies. And we'll say what happens if Shimon dies? What can Levi do? Not Shimon. What happens if Yehuda dies? Right, what happens if Yehuda dies? Then remember again, Levi, the last surviving brother, what could he do now with this widow of Shimon, who was supposed to do yibum with Yehuda? What could he do with her? Nothing. Why? Because she is now the sister of his wife. So essentially what will end up happening is because Yehuda died, you will end up negating any possibility of Yibum. To which the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, so if that's the case, why do you have to set up this case of 4 brothers? You can set up the case of 3 brothers as well, where one of the brothers dies, to which the Gemara says, to which the Gemara says the following. So lomi boy kamrinon. Lomi boy tlasa devadai batla mitzvas yavmin. So Rabosai, it goes without question that in the case of 3, you certainly will negate the mitzvah of yibum. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Tlasa nami Rashi says, why did you have to set up the case of the Mishnah with 4 brothers? So the kama de miyavim de matzinu lemeimar hahiramya kamei the kol shekain, we'll say 3 lines from the bottom of Rashi. Shlosha achin, beizmim nesun shtei achayos umesu, v'naflu shtein lefnei zeh, shtein azuros that harvayu alei ramya, v'zeh kasa chamura, v'chi nasif havi paga ba'achos zikukaso. Ela imi shum bidol mitzas yamin afilu tlasa nami, umesu anashim anesuim shtei achayos. Listen to this. So the Gemara says, if you're concerned about negating the mitzvah of Yibum, so you can even establish that in the case of 3 brothers. Why? We'll say 3 brothers, 2 of whom are married to 2 sisters, they both die. Both sisters now, both wives, both widows now fall before surviving brother. So what's the halacha? Surviving brother has to do chalitza. And I will say why. Now, if you hold yesh zeka, that's obvious why he has to do chalitza. But if you hold ein zeka, then why should he have to do chalitza? Why? Because the Ma'aser will say, if he just does yibum with one, then what? The other one is totally precluded from anything. Therefore, again, because we don't like to negate the mitzvah of yibum, better for him to do chalitza with both of the women. To which the Gemara says, you're right. It's lomi boy. Obviously, in a case of 3, where you're clearly negating the mitzvah of yibum by one of them, so you'll do chalitza with both. Aval dalid lemisa lo chashin. But maybe I'd say that in the case of 4 brothers, 2 of whom are surviving, I don't have to be choshesh for the fact that the 4th brother is going to die. To which the Gemara says, Kamashma, no, we are choshesh for misa. And therefore, again, we'll tell both brothers to go ahead and do chalitza, thereby ensuring that something happens for both of the women. If that's the case, chamisha nami, why don't you go ahead and say the same thing should apply in a case of 5 brothers? That lemais again, even if there are 3 surviving brothers, we should make each of the surviving brothers do chalitza, out of concern that lemaisa again, perhaps all of the surviving brothers will die. Well, this is actually very interesting. To which the Gemara says, lemisa detre lo chayshinon. Because we'll say the halacha is we're choshesh for the death of one person. We're not choshesh for the death of multiple people. So therefore, we'll say in a situation apparently where there were more than 2 surviving brothers, lemaisa we would allow the surviving brothers to do yibum and would not mandate chalitza. Amar Rava. So Amar Rava bar Afuna, Amar Rav. So we'll say Rava bar Afuna is telling the name of Rav. That's what? Shalosh achayos yevamos. Supposed to listen to this case. If you have three achayos yevamos, 3 women who are sisters who are yevamos. So we'll say. So what's the case over here? Remember again, Reuven, Shimon, Levi are married to 3 sisters. And what happens? So Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and all 3 of them die. And there are 2 surviving brothers, Shnaflu Fnei Shnei Achin, Yevamin, and they fall before 2 brothers, Yehuda and Yisachar. So Yehuda and Yisachar are now the surviving brothers. What's the halacha? Zeh choleitz la'achos, v'zeh choleitz la'achos. So what happens? I will say. So Yehuda does chalitza with one of the widows. Yisachar does chalitza with one of the brothers. Ve'emtzais tzricha chalitza mishnehem, and the 3rd wife requires chalitza from both of them. okay, when it means the middle wife, it just means the third wife, requires chalitza from both of them. Okay, so what's happening over here? So Amrli Rava, the fact that you said that the third wife requires chalitza from both of them, what does that mean? It must mean the following. Kasavris, you must hold, Kasavris yesh zeka, there is zeka. There is zeka. And I will say what that means. There is zeka is there's a marital bond between the surviving brothers and each of these three women. V'hav yela chalitza psula. And therefore what? By the time they get to the third wife, the third woman, the third widow, it is a deficient chalitza. And I will say, what does that mean? It's a deficient chalitza. So look at Rashi for just a moment. Midika amr tzricha chalitza mishneim kasavas yesh zeka v'hav yila chalitza psula v'chalitza psula tzricha lachzor. Kolomar, midika amr tzricha chalitza mishneim. The fact that she requires chalitza from both of them kasavas alima mitzlas zekas yavmin lemirmi atarvayu. I will say, now remember again, if you say yesh zeka means what? That lamaisa, every widow has a marital connection to who? To every surviving brother. Vaha chalitza al karka chalitza psulahi kilomar gerua shimratza liyaviv enu yachol the achos chalutzasahi hilchach lav ma'al yasi v'tzrich alachzor al kulan de lo mifka zeka de tarvai bechalitza dechad mishun nalima zeka v'rami yatamel. Listen to this, amazing. Listen to this. That watch. We'll say, watch this. So now remember, three widows. So Yehuda does chalitza with widow number one. Yisachar does chalitza with widow number two. By the time they get to widow number three, I both say, is there any possibility with chalitza with widow number three? Any possibility? No. Why? Because widow number three is achos chalutzaso. You are not permitted to marry the sister of a woman with whom you did chalitza. There is no possibility of yibum with wife number three, with widow number three. So both say, because that the Gemara says the chalitza is deficient, because it's not a full-fledged chalitza, because full-fledged chalitza only occurs when? When you have the possibility of yibum. But because there's no possibility of yibum with wife number three, therefore the chalitza is deficient. And interestingly enough, the Gemara says that whenever you have a deficient chalitza, it's not just enough for one of the brothers to do chalitza. What has to happen? Each of the brothers has to do chalitza. Okay, so the Gemara says, that's what it means, chalitza psula. Chalitza psula means literally a deficient chalitza. The chalitza psula tzarech lachzor kol ha'achin. And when you have a deficient chalitza, then you need a chalitza from each of the brothers. So which the Gemara says quickly, about just 30 seconds. Ihachi kamaisanami. If that's supposed to say, I don't understand. That logic should apply not just to the third wife. That logic should apply to each of the wives, right? Because lemaisa again, Rabbi say, in essence, really, as we said before, you can't do yibum with any of these women. Why can't you do yibum with any of these women? Because if you hold yesh zeka, then what? Then each of these women are called achos zikukaso. There's no yibum possibility with any of them. Therefore, again, anytime you do yibum chalitza with any, it's always a deficient chalitza. And therefore, what? And therefore, the ma'isa, each of the brothers should have to do chalitza with each of the surviving, with each of the widows. To which the Gemara says, "You're right. If all three of the brothers died at once and all of them were widowed at once, you would have each brother do chalitza with each of the women. But what's the case? What's the case? Rabbi say the three brothers did not die simultaneously; they died one after the other. Naflachada. So Ruvain died. Therefore, again, what happened? Chalatz lo Ruvain. Chalatz l'Ruvain. So also again, the Gemara uses a different name, but the idea is, so what happens? Brother number one died. So then again, one brother did chalitza with her. Nafla idach, the second brother died. Chalatz l'Shimon, second brother did chalitza with her. Nafla idach. At this point in time, when third brother dies, nafla lahai. Nafkala. So nafla idach. Chalatz. So what happens? Now third brother dies. I will say at this point in time, when third brother dies, so third wife has for each brother the status of what? Achos chalutzaso. She is the sister of the woman with whom he did chalitza. Therefore, Abosai again, their chalitza is going to. There's no way they could do yibum. Therefore, it's a deficient chalitza. So what has to happen? So chalatz lahai. So one brother comes along and does chalitza. Mafka zeka. So removes his zeka. Chalatz lahai. The other brother comes along and does chalitza. Mafka lezeka. So ultimately, we'll remove his zeka. We'll stop over here. We're not finished with this. We're going to continue with this tomorrow. Why is there zeka at all?